Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.
Welcome to Literate Discussions. I'm M. David Hornbuckle. Today we're talking to Troy Kozak, who is a memoirist and a teacher in St. Louis, Missouri. We'll be talking about Flannery O'Connor's story, A Good Man is Hard to Find. Hey Troy, how's it going?
Going well. How are you?
All right. So we are talking about the Flannery O'Connor story, A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Indeed.
And is this a story that you teach in your classroom?
So I have taught it. I've taught it to sophomores at the beginning of the year when we do kind of a short story unit. And it's kind of interesting to teach it in a city like St. Louis that kind of fashions itself as if it were an East Coast city and isn't. But it also isn't the South, right? It's distinctly not the South. And so there is a lot that I think my students miss. They need a lot of context just to understand Flannery and what she's up to, and the idea of Southern Gothic. They don't necessarily understand the southern part of the Southern Gothic.
And yeah, I'm not sure that my students would understand the Gothic part of Southern Gothic necessarily. So let's talk about that a little bit. Do you have a definition off the top of your head of Southern Gothic?
I was looking it up earlier today and kind of reframing it. I'm actually reading Wise Blood for the first time right now. I'm kind of almost.
Oh, that's a great novel.
It's so fun, and I love Flannery O'Connor so much. I've read many of her stories, if not all of them. And so when I think about Southern Gothic, like, she's one of the first people that come to mind, because she's interested in the macabre, right? She's interested in the darkness of the world, and so that's where the Gothic part comes in, right?
Right.
Like, we get maybe grotesque imagery. She's quick to show us grotesque imagery of people who are ignorant, right? That's one of her favorite targets, of people who think they know what they're talking about but do not know what they're talking about. That's her favorite kind of person to put under the crosshairs.
Yeah, and I think an example of that person would be the grandmother in this story, right?
Absolutely, yeah. She's the person we want to put under the crosshairs in this story.
And boy, does she.
Absolutely. And then I think, the southern part of that comes not only with the landscape, which is actually really important to this story, and the knowledge of the landscape and the patriotism of your state and your pride, which comes up a lot in this. But also, I think the what it means to be a good person in the country, right? I mean, I think of her story, Good Country People is the other story that I like to teach along with this one.
Right.
It's
a similar story in a lot of ways, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of ways.
About a family in the country who gets swindled by a guy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And the mother in that story is similar to the grandmother in this story. They're interested in goodness and what does goodness mean. And of course, when we talk about the South and we talk about the 1950s, like, goodness means white in a certain kind of way, and it definitely means Christian. And so we see that she's always kind of coming up across these Christian values. And I think
Flannery O'Connor also was Catholic.
Yeah.
And of course, living in South Georgia, a region that is not very Catholic, right?
Right.
And so she writes about Christianity a lot, but she writes about Protestants. She writes about fundamentalists and Protestants who don't meet her definition of righteousness.
Yeah. And I would double down with that by saying Wise Blood, as a book, examines false preachers and what false prophets are. But when you expand that out to a story like A Good Man is Hard to Find, he's a false prophet, right? And actually, right. The grandmother is also a false prophet, and they're talking to each other. And maybe the difference is that he knows he's a false prophet, and it doesn't matter to him.
Right. Yeah. He is basically amoral, right?
Right.
Whereas the grandmother has morals, but they're questionable morals.
Yeah, and he's he actually has rules, right? So he has a
Okay.
certain kind of ethic about him, which I think resonates in the final lines, right?
Yes,
That
yeah, I was about to
he
look
would have
that
been
up,
a good.
actually. She would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. And then, some fun, Bobby Lee said.
Mm,
Shut up, Bobby Lee, the misfit said. It's no real pleasure in life. And that's the final line. But the one we were thinking of was the one I read first,
yeah,
right?
right,
Yeah.
right.
Where he kind of shows that he has some kind of rules to his morality
Yeah,
and the way he
yeah.
functions.
And he talks about that a little earlier too, where he kind of, he wants to write down everything that he's ever done to make sure it matches up with any kind of judgment that he gets.
Is there anything else that you talk about to your students when you talk about this story?
So, well, I mean, we have a number of different things. We have the overt racism of the grandmother and how she clearly is speaking from a different era, which I think Flannery O'Connor is very interested in this in the process where we're kind of just before the civil rights when she's really at the height of her powers, right? So when she's publishing this story is 1953, according to the one that I pulled. So we're just before these things are starting to happen. And instead of, and she has other stories where the racism is more explicit, but the racism here by the grandmother, just nobody seems to really appreciate her racism. There's my dog. So she wants us to be with the same level of understanding of that as her son and her grandchildren, where like they just kind of roll their eyes at her racism. That's kind of outdated, even in
1953. Yeah.
So I mean, O'Connor isn't going to press too hard on that button, at least in this story. And then in other stories, we see like, oh yeah, she's actually really confronting racism and making a fool out of characters who are racist. That, and then we also see it in the way that she looks at society, right? So you're a good person because you were born to good people, or you're of common blood. She actually uses the word, I know you're not of common blood when she talks to the misfit. So we definitely see like the hierarchy.
The way that race and class and regionalism are dealt with in this story are very typical of Southern culture and Southern literature.
And something else that I think she does throughout her stories, like she likes to put us in places that are small, places that are rural, places where poverty is the norm, and then we can kind of see how people react, right?
Yeah, most of her stories only have 2 or 3 characters in them, right? And so she basically she takes a couple of people, puts them in a situation, and then waits to see what happens.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
You know, some people say there's only 2 types of stories, right? A stranger comes to town,
right,
or a man goes on a journey.
right. And it's kind of funny that this story has both of those, because the family is traveling, right? They're on their way to an adventure, but the stranger is the one who shows up,
right?
To really
and appropriately named the misfit because he doesn't fit the role, right?
Right. So and of course it's also fun because this story kind of, it's not from the grandmother's perspective, right? But it's definitely over her shoulder. She's our protagonist, and she's also, she's the villain and the victim at the same time, which is interesting. So she's the one that kind of causes all of the problems. We get the sense that if she doesn't flag down the misfit and his crew, then they might not have stopped and come back. She, of course, is the one who says we have to turn around and go to this house, and makes it up, and it's the wrong house. She's the one that brings the cat that causes the accident and disturbs the cat. And then she's the one who recognizes the misfit, and that's what really does them in, right? Is maybe they wouldn't have been murdered, all of them, if she hadn't recognized him.
Let's just break down really quickly what that line means that we talked about earlier. She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every day of her life.
It's one that changes for me. the different times that I read it. But I think especially on the last couple times that I've talked about it, there's the gun is accountability, right? The gun is accountability, but it's also being scared for your life, right? That truth is going to come out. You think about a concept like deathbed confessions, or the regrets that we have at the end of our lives. That's where potentially the truest version of yourself is going to come out, right? When you know that there's nothing else that's going to happen except for death. And what does she do for him in her final moments? I mean, this is a woman who watches her son and grandson go out into the woods, fairly certain of what's going to happen to them, and then gets the confirmation, right, with the gunshots. They are being killed. And then she has no protest. She doesn't say, like, what have you done? There's no outrageous anger. There's nothing except for what? Her begging for herself. You wouldn't kill a lady. And then what happens? Well, then they take her sister, or her daughter-in-law, right, and the granddaughter and the baby, and no persistence. Now even if it was foggy before, it's clear as day. These people are going to be killed, and she has no even groan of disapproval. It's all about herself, right? And then what happens when she knows that she can't change her fate? She prays for him. That's how I take it away, right? That only the grave accountability, the knowledge of death, and the inability to push it off at one more instant.
And I would say that this is an instance of Flannery O'Connor maybe even critiquing a type of Protestant morality where maybe in her view, like, people only do the right thing when they're afraid of what the consequences are going to be.
Right.
They don't do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. They do the right thing because they're afraid of what might happen if they don't. God's punishment.
You can contrast that a little bit with her son. We get one description of her son that he is in a runner's pose. And he could probably run away. He might even get away from them if he takes off, but he doesn't, because he's going to be with his family. He's not going to save himself.
All right. Well, thanks for Zooming with me.
Absolutely.
And I'll see you soon.
All right. See you, buddy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.